In 1870, Jacob Riis, a Danish-born immigrant, traveled to America with just $40 in his pocket. Riis boarded the steamboat Iowa, crammed to the top with immigrants and cargo. After 5 days in New York City, Riis had spent nearly all of his money and was in need of work. Riis traveled around taking one odd job after another, often poor and homeless, until he found work as a carpenter. Finally, financially stable, Riis was able to pursue his dream and experiment with writing. Though his first submissions were turned down, this did not stop him. Eventually, Riis was given a job to report on the rich and poor immigrant communities for the New York News Association. The company soon went bankrupt, but Riis was able to buy it with the money in his savings. In 1876, he learned his 2 older brothers, his aunt, and his teenage love, Elizabeth's fiancé, had passed. He wrote a letter to Elizabeth proposing to her, which she accepted, and asked him to move back to Denmark. Because of his hard work, he was able to sell the newspaper for 5 times what he bought it for, allowing Riis to move back to Denmark with a good amount of money and marry Elizabeth. After living in Denmark for a few months, Riis and Elizabeth moved back to New York, where he was an editor, writer, speaker, and advocate. In the mid-1800s, a group of urban realist artists called the Ashcan School challenged convention by representing the everyday life of working-class people. Some of the Ashcan artists worked as illustrators for local newspapers. The middle-class Ashcan artists were hardly advocates or social reformers, though. As professor and curator H. Barbara Weinberg explains, because they avoided civil unease, class tensions, and the grit of the streets, their works are never as direct or disturbing as those of their European counterparts, or of the reformist images of American photographers such as Jacob Riis. Equipped with his camera, tripod, and flash powder, Riis began taking photographs of the immigrant slums in the Lower East Side during night shifts as a police reporter for the New York Tribune. Using the innovation of a magic lantern, Riis was able to project images onto a sheet or walls around the city, illuminating the horrid living conditions of the slums. Riis would stand next to the projected images and speak out about the unsafe conditions of the tenements. After moving to the Evening Sun, he began working on his seminal book, How the Other Half Lives. Riis went from slum to slum, documenting the plight of poor Irish, German, Italian, Jewish, and Chinese immigrants. Despite being an immigrant himself, Riis perpetuated common racial stereotypes of the time in his writing. Although there is debate whether Riis was himself intolerant of new immigrants or simply used the stereotypes as a rhetorical device. Interestingly, Riis did not consider himself a photographer.
I'm a writer and a newspaper man. I'm no good at all as a photographer.
Riis said of his own writing,
"It did not make much of an impression. These things rarely do," put in mere words, until my negatives, still dripping from the dark room, came to reinforce them.
My name is Kate Meyer, and I'm a curator here at the Spencer Museum of Art. You see photographers like Riis or Lewis Hine turning their lens to the poor or those who deciders, people who have money, clout, and influence, may not see or respond to on a daily basis. And to be able to see them, to humanize them, to make those connections becomes very important. If you have a social ambition to raise awareness or to cultivate empathy, that changes the truth you strive for. There's a Lewis Hine in our collection where he has posed a tenement family in a composition that strongly resembles a Renaissance-era painting of the Holy Family. And that is persuasive. That is Hine using his skills as an artist photographer to make you make a connection with a subject that you are ingrained, whether you realize it or not, and see that subject as good, morally good, and translate that perception of moral goodness to the poor. There were competing schools of thought, social Darwinism, that they were poor because they were bad. They were poor because they deserved it. They were poor because they earned it. And he is asserting a very different kind of point of view through that combination of references. These photographers are venturing into the tenements and into the factories with the express purpose of showing these workers, these families, these people to a larger audience and showing them to a larger world in a way that reveals their humanity or the unjust, unfair, and unreasonable environment they inhabit. That engagement with the cultivation of empathy is an incredibly powerful ambition for a photographer.
Riis met Theodore Roosevelt, then president of the New York Board of Police Commissioners, while working on How the Other Half Lives. Roosevelt joined Riis to investigate the slums on several occasions, and would go on to enact progressive-era reforms as president. Roosevelt once said,
"The countless evils which lurk in the dark corners of our civic institutions, which stalk abroad in the slums, and have their permanent abode in crowded tenement houses, have met Mr. Riis, the most formidable opponent ever encountered by them in New York City."
Riis advocated for better housing conditions, adequate lighting, better sanitation, and the construction of city parks and playgrounds. He called for the use of public funds to demolish old structures in the slums. In addition to photographs, Riis included population density, death rates, and arrests in his writings. His writing and photography inspired the Tenement Housing Committee of New York to draw plans for Mulberry Park. It took 6 years for the committee to buy the land and build the park because city officials did not want to interfere in the affairs of the tenement owners. In 1891, Riis published a story about the New York water supply, documenting the conditions of the watershed, which supplied drinking water to the city. It was being polluted by other towns and cities. Riis learned it would take around 7 days for the cholera bacillus to live and multiply in the water systems. This story resulted in the purchase of areas surrounding the New Crompton Reservoir by the city, who then maintained and developed the watershed. Riis also collaborated with the King's Daughters, an organization of Episcopalian women, to establish a settlement house for new immigrants. The affordable housing projects were completed in 1949 as one phase of the city's urban renewal plan. The housing projects are maintained by the New York City Housing Authority and are home to some 4,500 residents today. The settlement house continues to offer social programs for residents of public housing developments in Queens. Riis urged the middle and upper classes to be benefactors, prompting them to take part in reforming society. He demonstrated how poverty was a result of surrounding conditions that could be improved through social reform. Riis wrote,
"I'm a believer in organized, systematic charity upon the evidence of my senses."
Roosevelt once said Riis possessed
"The great gift of making others see what he saw and feel what he felt."
It is difficult to overlook the evidence of what he saw and felt is expressed in his writing and his photographs.